Hey everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us here today. This panel is about the systems of bias that are deeply embedded in tech, the kind you can't just sort of patch out, as it were. But I'd like to start out by allowing Haben Girma, our guest today, to introduce herself and her means of communicating. And Haben, maybe you can also tell us a little more while you're speaking about how the benefits of the latest technology compare with the barriers that it introduces for people with disabilities.
Hello, everyone. This is Haben speaking. I'm a disability justice advocate. And one of the reasons I came to this work is because I'm deaf-blind in a world mostly designed for people who could see and hear. So most of the technology that's built was not imagined for disabled people, which is frustrating and also absolutely ridiculous. Tech has so much potential to exist in visual forms, in auditory forms, in tactile forms, and even smell and taste. It's up to the designers to create tools that everyone can use. And I want to describe one of the tools I'm using right now. So to speak, I'm using my own voice. But to know what other panelists are saying, I'm using a Braille computer. I'm holding it up right now. Along the bottom are Braille dots. So as people speak, I have an assistant typing what people are saying, and the words pop up in Braille. So I'll be reading the words and then responding by voice. So you might notice a delay between when someone speaks and when I respond. Back to you, Devin.
Thank you very much, Haben. So the whole idea that technologies, as you've mentioned, can and do harm or benefit different groups specifically is very much at the heart of your work, Mutale. Have you found that the bias there is primarily in the technology itself, or is it in the people that are using it, or is that distinction not really meaningful anymore?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for that great question. So I came to this work really through policy. And in the policy world, we're thinking about impact, right? So we're not necessarily thinking about technical infrastructure or HR. But one of the things that I found throughout my career, both in industry and in research, is that the two are linked. So there is a problem of technologies which are inherently racist or sexist or ableist, as Haben so beautifully pointed out. But there is another part which Haben really spoke to as well, is an imaginary for technologies that could actually serve all people. And if the scientists who are creating those technologies don't have experience outside of their own experiences, or we're sitting in a moment where Google AI has got rid of Michelle Mitchell and Timnit Gebru, both of whom were technologists from researchers from minoritized communities who are thinking about new and different ways that tools could be designed, then you may not see them coming to products. So I would say that the two are definitely married, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of this conversation to kind of get much more deeper into that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And Safiya, your work has found bias it's both more obvious and more subtle, specifically in, among other things, search engines. What would you say is the main failure by companies like Google and others who have attempted to organize and present information from the internet?
Well, thanks so much for inviting me here. And I also feel, so strongly that these conversations about the harm and the neglect, quite frankly, in technology design should be the most important conversation that is going on in Silicon Valley right now, quite frankly. And I'm really grateful to people like Haben and Mutale and so many women, in particular, women of color, LGBTQ women, and scholars and journalists who've really pushed these conversations into the mainstream, quite frankly. So I'm really grateful to be in their company. And, my concerns were with what we might think of as just banal technologies, things that we really don't give a second thought to, and that also present themselves as widely neutral and valuable. And of course, this is where I became interested in looking at Google search, because Google's own kind of declaration that they were interested in organizing all the world's knowledge, I think, was a pretty big claim. Of course, I'm coming out of a field of library and information science and thinking about, thousands of years of librarians, for example, around the world who have been indeed organizing the world's knowledge, and what it means to have an advertising company, quite frankly, data mine our knowledge, but also commingle it with things like disinformation, propaganda, patently false information and ideas, and really flatten our ability to understand knowledge and good information. And of course, we know that knowledge and good information are essential for things like democracy. So I think that for me, this has been a really important place to look, and I stay a bit focused on that because I see how profoundly that technology is designed in discriminatory ways, in misrepresentative ways. And I think that the public deserves to have strong information and knowledge institutions and organizations, especially that fairly represent people who are oppressed and marginalized, and that knowledge needs to be used in service of liberating people from oppression and from that kind of marginalization. So, this is kind of what brought me to looking at that specific technology.
Yeah, the three of you all mention basically the deepness of the problem. This isn't just a recent thing, and it's not a simple thing. It goes way back to the origins of the technologies and the companies themselves. Haben, you mentioned that the internet and the web was not designed from the start with people with disabilities in mind. Mutale, you mentioned that the companies are not involving people that need to be involved in order to produce an equitable amount of software. And Safiya basically just said, it's an advertising company that's attempting to organize and present the world's information. That's a fundamental conflict of interest. Yes. Do you think it's possible for the tech industry or a single company to accomplish a goal like organizing and presenting information or creating an equitable AI? Maybe Safiya, you can start with that.
Well, in libraries, we understand, for example, that there are many parameters and constraints to deciding what to keep, what's valuable, what's credible, what's been vetted, what is scientific, what has artistic value. And those ideas are, quite frankly, contested all around the world. I mean, it isn't that there's a unanimity of, values. And of course, this is one of the reasons why, for example, librarians of color and libraries in other parts of the world outside of the United States have really struggled to not have English language dominance, white American dominance, European dominance in, let's say, all of the knowledge spheres that are legitimated in the world. And so these things are very contested. They're political and important issues around, being part of a cultural record of a society and having one's knowledge be used to further a more equitable society. So I find it really troubling that those with the most money get to buy their way to the top, which is, of course, what happens in a search engine. Those with the most capital win. Also, if you happen to be a product or a service or a website that furthers Google's own interests, or other Bing, all of them, all the commercial search engines really have the same shared logic, which is helping them to be as profitable as possible. And this is one of the reasons why you can find disinformation, pornography, misrepresentation, racist ideas, things that are titillating and profitable. I mean, of course, we live in the United States. Racism and sexism are big business. They're extremely profitable. Ask anyone in Hollywood. So when you have these kinds of technologies that are driven by a profit imperative, then it's actually profit at all cost. And this is where minoritized voices and people who are not part of like the profit driver are really quite frankly disposable. And one of the ways I think that we've seen that most profoundly is the way in which the worst kinds of ideas sometimes in very important social crises come to the fore because, disinformation is also profitable. It goes viral. It makes search engines a lot of money. So I think these things are extremely dangerous, obviously. And, I tried to document many, many, many instances of this in my book. But of course, I could write a whole nother book since that book came out of these kinds of failures. I'm not doing that, by the way, but I could.
Well, we'll expect it anyway. You heard it here first. That's the news. I actually you touched on the disinformation and these that aspect that actually dovetails well with something I was going to ask Haben. Haben, you mentioned this really kind of wild conspiracy theory that has been spreading on TikTok that Helen Keller didn't exist, and that it's especially difficult because TikTok's accessibility is so bad. Deafblind people such as yourself can't get on there to combat this disinformation. So what kind of situation, what kind of new biases and problems does it create when there is not only disinformation but inequity in your ability to address that disinformation?
We have to go back to the explanation that tech does not have to be accessible, or tech does not have to be inaccessible. So deaf-blind people have used technology for quite a while and were early users of technology, including being designers and engineers. We are on many of the social media platforms. There are blind and deaf-blind people on Twitter. TikTok was not designed with accessibility in mind. So there are very few of us on TikTok. I don't know if there are any deaf-blind people on TikTok. So when you have a space where there are few disabled people, ableism grows. Ableism is the assumption that disabled people are inferior to non-disabled people. It's widespread. It comes up as design, laws, policies. So people on TikTok have questioned the existence of Helen Keller because the people on the platform can't imagine how a deaf-blind person would write a book or travel around the world. Things that are well documented that Helen Keller did. There are even videos of her giving talks, signing books, videos demonstrating how she read and write through Braille. And there's also lots of information on how blind and deaf-blind people are doing these things today, writing books today, using technology today. So when you have these spaces where there are no disabled people or very few disabled people, ableism, negative biases grow more rapidly. And that's incredibly harmful because the people there are missing out on talented, diverse voices. Our communities are richer when we have all kinds of voices, including disabled voices, participating in conversations. And in terms of tech accessibility, Guidelines on how to make tech accessible have existed for decades. There's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines for making websites accessible. Apps, mobile platforms have their own accessibility guidelines. There's Android accessibility guidelines and iOS accessibility guidelines. So the tools already exist for designer. It's just that many designers themselves suffer from ableism, the assumption that disabled people can't use smartphones, can't use websites, therefore they feel like they don't need to bother to think about how to make it accessible. So ableism gets built into the products. And then the people who use the platform also spread ableism. And that's not the kind of world we want.
No kidding. Thank you for that. And that also addressed a couple of the questions that I have from the audience about resources for designing for accessibility. And we can get to some more of those later. And actually, a couple of the ones that I have here from the audience are very much what I was about to ask you, Mutale, about racial bias in, for example, the justice system. Obviously, you work very specifically with facial recognition, among other things. Because this is an especially urgent problem because it's being deployed by a racist justice system. So what are some other technologies that you think, in addition to that, what do you think are some other technologies that are being deployed against Black communities, against marginalized communities that we might not be aware of?
So I'm going to say two things. I'm definitely going to answer that question. And I definitely did not bring a charger for my computer into this room. So after I answer the question, I'm going to go dark for a couple of moments and then get my charger. So I apologize.
No problem.
In advance. But thank you for the question. Yes. So back to my policy days, one of the bills that I was responsible for introducing was the No Biometric Barriers to Housing Act that came in the last Congress. Remember that one where we had like Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and Trump? So we knew we were just speaking to each other and it wasn't going to go anywhere, but we introduced it anyway, because why not? We can always try to have a better world. And one of the things that really brought me to was this whole host of technologies that, when used by security forces or policing, reinforce these discriminatory impacts on Black communities. So that could be the way license plate readers were used by ICE to identify cars. And when they pulled people over, they would do these additional biometric checks, whether it was fingerprinting or iris readers, and then use that to criminalize these people and put them on the road to deportation, which is an example of how technology being used in the face of security, in this case, national security, would have this horrible human rights impact. Or we saw at the Capitol riot, which I'm sure we were all really happy with, the way that we could use cell phone towers and getting into, and I'm at TechCrunch talking about technology, and I've forgotten the name of the technology, but that's mine. I also don't have a charger. It's a thing. You know, like where security forces can actually tap into your phone and get your location data from, and that was what was used largely at the Capitol riot to put people on no-fly zones. We saw this same thing during the uprisings of 2020 with George Floyd, where police forces were able to see who had been at a demonstration. By the way, it is our constitutional right and our First Amendment right to protest our government, right? But we often think about First Amendment rights to say that Helen Keller doesn't exist on a private platform like TikTok, which is reading of the law. Different question. I can get to that later. But we're seeing how all of these technologies on their own are impacting Black lives. But imagine when all of those technologies are together. Imagine when here in New York, I walk to the subway to take a train because I have to go to work. This is old days, not these days. And my face is captured by a CCTV camera that could wrongly put me at the scene of a crime because it does not recognize my humanity, because Black faces are not recognized by those systems. That's a very old idea. That really takes us back to this idea that Black people aren't human. They're in fact 3/5 of a human, which was at the founding of this country, right? But we're reproducing that idea through technology. And then I log on to a system where I'm again faced with similar technologies that discriminate. And it's that kind of interlocking weave of oppression that used to exist in the analog world has now become systematized and now become just part of how we decide who gets benefits, just part of how we decide who gets bail and who doesn't get bail. And lastly, before all my charge runs out, the thing that's so worrying about that is we don't have the case law or the policy to combat this. So very quickly in the criminal justice system, there is a case, Michael Lomas vs. the state of Wisconsin, where Compass, which is a sentencing algorithm, was used to decide how much time this defendant would have. In the ruling memo, the judge says that part of how the decision was made was using this algorithm. And when that case is contested, when that case reaches appeal, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin then says, well, you know, Michael Lomas was a pretty bad guy, did all of these things. It wasn't the only thing that was used. It was just a thing that was used. So we're allowing the algorithm to decide what happens. That's scary, particularly because that was in 2017. But fast forward to 2021, and Niger Peters in New Jersey sat in jail for 10 days when wrongly identified by facial recognition. He then was able to use data to fight data and prove he was 30 miles away from the scene of the crime. Of course, the algorithm thought we all looked alike. That's not a joke, by the way. That's horrifying and terrible.
Yeah.
And because he didn't have bail money, which is another oppressive system, sat in jail for 10 days. So I really could overtalk on that one point, but it doesn't allow, and this is something I would love to get into conversation with Haben about, just because the technology is deployed in a way that is harmful in one sense, we can't allow that to justify technological ableism in another sense. So even as we're thinking about these issues, we have to be nuanced. And it's actually one of the reasons why I left white papers, and I still write academic papers, but I left white papers behind and started to think about how can I use art and culture to tell these stories, was because the nuance is also getting lost. And it goes back to something Safiya said, this knowledge is being generated by mostly feminized folks, mostly folks of color, many Black women. We're 3 Black women on this panel. And the fact that we are generating the knowledge means that automatically the people in Silicon Valley don't believe us. So we also have these communication barriers that we have to fight. And I am going to get my charger on
Get that cable, don't worry.
Yes, I'll be right back.
No worries. Thank you for that. Yeah, you touched on a lot of things that I was going to ask about in the first place, but I want to hand it to Safiya for a minute and then Haben as well. Safiya, new technologies, it seems like, as Mutale mentioned, people are so eager to embrace new technologies. Companies are so eager to embrace new technologies that are coming down the road, machine learning, AI, and facial recognition. It feels like there's not enough time to address the potential problems with them, to document them, to make policy decisions around them. How do we make sure that, as someone just asked in the comments here, how do we bring these conversations to companies and make sure that they're as excited about equity and accessibility as they are about bringing that technology fundamentally to market? And also, Haben, I would love to hear your thoughts on Mutale's the question of accessibility for technology, as well as we'll start with Safiya and then go to Haben. I don't want to overload here.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that one of the things we're seeing, and I really can appreciate the audience of people who would be listening to this today, this session, are people who likely are designers or work in tech companies. So, my comment will be kind of geared to assuming that kind of audience, versus what I might say, let's say, to lawmakers. I think that, first of all, there's a tremendous amount of risk by not taking up these issues. I've heard that the risk management profile, for example, for a company, let's say like Facebook, in terms of harm, what they can't solve with software and AI, that they use, human beings, quite frankly, to sort through, moderators, for example. The risk that they face is probably estimated around $2 billion. All right, this is what I've heard from experts who work on Facebook. So if you're talking about a $2 billion risk, I think then this is a decision that exceeds the design desires of the software engineers, right? Now we're talking about the market position. If you're a startup and you're facing significant risk, let's say legislatively, that you might fall and find yourself the subject of a Federal Trade Commission investigation or Department of Justice investigation. Now in California, we're increasingly seeing more privacy and different types of protections come into existence. And I think you have to think far beyond, like what you can do versus what you should do, or what's ethical or responsible to do. And I think these conversations now can no longer be avoided. This is a place where founders, venture capitalists, every VC in the Valley on Sand Hill Road should have a person who is responsible for thinking about the adverse effects of the products that they might invest in, or the companies that they might. How did we get Elizabeth Holmes? So I just want to, of course, no Black woman would ever enjoy the opportunity to just burn through millions of dollars on nonsense. So, you think about the kinds of discrimination also that people of color in particular experience as founders and trying to start up their ideas. Certainly much more mindful, I think, across the board around these kinds of risk, again, conversations than others. So, and I, sorry to everybody who's watching who's friends with Elizabeth. I almost wore my black turtleneck because she took that was my look. So, I think these questions about morality and ethics and justice sometimes are these questions are posed to the wrong arm of the organization, and new employees should be hired. I mean, I often say these companies should be hiring people with masters and PhDs in African American studies, in ethnic studies, in gender studies. I promise you, they're going to have an analysis about, hold on, let's contextualize how this might roll out. I've looked myself. People ask me, they show me their technologies all the time. I remember, some men developing a tech and asking me for my opinion. In about 30 seconds, I was like, this is a stalker app, right? And they were like, what? And I was like, yeah, like no woman is going to want. And then I explained to them all the ways this could be used powerfully for anonymous stalking. So these kinds of, it's like the lack of ability to see and understand from many points of views, including the kinds of things Haben is talking about, but also including, the ways in which certain kinds of products and services can get inverted, weaponized, as well. There have to be more people in the conversation. I think a lot of things shouldn't even get out of the gate, quite frankly, and they wouldn't. They wouldn't pass muster if they had to go through a rigorous kind of evaluation. And those are things that companies can do right now before they wait for regulators or the Department of Justice to knock on their door.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. I want to give Haben the chance to talk about this. That is exactly what you're talking about, including every stakeholder from the beginning and including accessibility from the beginning. Haben, can you tell us how to balance the revolutionary capability of technology like facial recognition, like AI, with the risks, because it can be so transformative for people with disabilities, for anybody really, but we have to balance that with the risks. Can you help me contextualize and sort of figure out the balance there?
The answer to most of these questions is have the people involved. Nothing about us without us is the saying in the disability justice movement. So if VCs and companies are thinking about investing in a solution that they think will be good for the world, ask disabled justice advocates, get us involved. Nothing about us without us. In the past few years, there have been AI-based accessibility solutions heavily invested in, millions of dollars by VCs, on the assumption and claim that it'll make websites and apps more accessible to disabled people. I've tried them. They're terrible. They actually make websites worse for me to use. And VCs continue to invest in these solutions. And these companies continue to promote these claims that you can add one line of code and it'll make your website automatically accessible to blind and other disabled people, and it'll make your website automatically compliant to ADA requirements. I've tried those websites. It really makes things worse for blind and disabled people. We need the VCs to also connect with disability justice advocates and really find someone who with knowledge and background in accessibility and tech. Same thing for any company. All the companies should have technology existing and tech in the process of being built, should be consulted on accessibility. It's easier to make something accessible if you design for accessibility rather than trying to make it accessible afterwards. It's like having an elevator in a physical building. You don't build the structure and then think about adding an elevator. You think about adding an elevator before you design it so it fits in smoothly. Same thing with digital accessibility. Design for the start and include us. Nothing about us without us.
Absolutely. Thank you for saying that. That absolutely seems right to me. I wish that we had more time to talk about this, but I have to wrap this panel up. I think we've already gone over time. My producers are going to kill me. But this has been super interesting. I would love to continue the conversation with all of you after the fact, and I'm definitely going to pick up the thread with you. Thank you so much for joining us and helping me understand some of the stuff way better than I did half an hour ago.
Thank you.
Thank you.